Welcome to Reel Filmmaking. My name is Corey, and today we're talking about story structure. So quick disclaimer, I am not an expert on story structure or a professional or a guru. I don't even know really what you would call that person, but a lot of my information from story structure comes from writing, doing short films, studying literature, analyzing it, a lot of what I learned in school about how to talk about story structure, and honestly, I've learned a lot of this from watching movies. So another thing that I will know is there are a lot of different schools of thought about how to talk about story structure. So particularly with movies, or if you're looking more at like literature and like plays and narratives and novels and stuff like that, I'm gonna basically present to you what I think is an easy way to understand story structure in regards to film. So there's some elements I kind of borrow from different places. There's not necessarily one unified thing. If you want to dig deeper into story structure, you certainly can. Just Google story structure for films or literature or whatever, and you'll be good to go. But if you're somebody who just wants to learn how to tell a good story, how to incorporate that into your short films or your narratives, or if you're somebody who just wants to understand how stories work in movies, well, you're in the right place. So you've probably heard the old adage that a story has a beginning, middle, and end. And that is true, whether you're looking at a film or a book or whatever, a story needs to have some place where it starts and where things happen in the middle, and then a place where it ends. And so for films, the easiest way to think about that is that beginning, middle, and end as Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Each of these acts have different components, and you're going to want to make sure as you're writing your story or you're like evaluating a film that you pick up on these. So in Act 1, we have the exposition and the inciting incident. So the exposition is essentially like when you start a film, like it gives us all the information about like where we are, the location, what is unique about this world, and it also introduces us to the main characters. Why is this character special? Who is their family? Why are they part of this world? Like all those connections we see up front in the exposition. And that moves us to the inciting incident. In some schools of storytelling, this is called the call to adventure. It is the catalyst that makes everything happen. Without the inciting incident, you don't have a movie. My light just died on me. And so for example, if this is like, a murder mystery, this is the event that people find out about the murder and they're trying to figure out like who did it. Or if it's a movie where somebody gets kidnapped or something and like the group has to go find the person, this is where that person is kidnapped and the group learns about it. So after we have those things, that moves us into Act 2. And arguably, in most films, Act 2 is the longest stretch between Act 1, 2, and 3. In a movie that's about 2 hours, Act 2 will probably be anywhere from like an hour to an hour and a half, just because there's so much that needs to happen in Act 2. So an easy way to think about Act 2 is actually it's kind of like a big piece of pie and you cut it in two. So you have the first half of Act 2 and you have the second half of Act 2. In the first half of Act 2, you get what's called rising action. This is where it's like the group sets out on their quest to do this thing, or the person, starts to look into clues about the mystery that's happening or whatever. These are things to help to build the tension, thus we call it rising action. And then you have something called a midpoint or a mid-climax. There's lots of different names for it, but it's basically kind of like we've built some tension and then something happens. So this might be the first time like maybe a hero tries out some of their new abilities against like, the forces of evil, and maybe they win or maybe they lose. Or maybe this is a time where like a buddy cop duo tries to figure something out and it backfires on them and they have to still learn how to work together. This midpoint is supposed to be like a marker that shows us like how the characters will continue to grow in achieving the goal that is ultimately going to lead to, the finale of the film. Then we're still in Act 2, we're in the second half of Act 2, and we have more rising action. This is where things are happening. Sometimes this can be where maybe like a subplot is introduced, here or even earlier in like the first half of Act 2, but lots of different things can happen again to build the tension as we move towards the climax of the film. And that leads us to the climax. Now, a lot of people sometimes can misunderstand the climax to be like, the last thing that happens in a movie, or, the grand finale, or it's like, like when the credits roll. But actually the climax is the highest point of tension in a film. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the last thing that happens in the movie. It's what all of the energy, all of the rising action, all of the subplots, all of that has been building to. And so it might be the final confrontation with like the ultimate villain, or it might be the showdown where the person figures out the mystery of what's going on, or it might be any number of things, but it's where the highest point of tension is felt in the film and when all of that converges. Once that happens, once that thing is put into play, nothing will be the same. The characters that make these decisions, that have this climactic event, when that happens, it's like it changes the trajectory moving forward in the rest of the story. And so now we're into Act 3. So with the climax happening, we have what's called the falling action and the resolution that make up Act 3. So the falling action is like, though the climax, the highest point of tension has been felt, there's still other things that have to happen. You know, in the climax, maybe the mystery was solved and they figured out who the killer was, but then there's all these implications of things that have to happen for the person to be apprehended, for other people to figure out what's going on. Like, all of that would be considered falling action. And then you have the resolution, and the resolution is where everything gets tied up, where, you know, it's like the hero returns home to their family and peace is restored to the land. Those sorts of things encompass the resolution. So that is a very quick breakdown of story structure. It's kind of like my story structure 101. Hopefully you'll find this helpful in crafting your own short films, or if you're somebody who just wants to understand how story works more in film. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, make sure to like it, subscribe to Reel Filmmaking for more content related to cameras, storytelling, creative process coming on a weekly basis. And until next time, keep making movies and watching movies, and I'll see you on Reel Filmmaking.